let me just move on. Okay, so this is how I got into this topic as a criminologist. My key area of study is gangs in London, and I have a book out next year looking at that. And while I was researching into that, there was this terrible incident in April 2009, where this 16-year-old boy called Shea Ogunyemi was killed, and he was killed in this park here, Larkhall Park, which is in South London. So you've got Vauxhall in the centre up here, and it's just a bit south, Stockwell and Brixton. This is where Jean-Charles de Menezes was shot. So just a few hundred yards from there. Very nice park, but there are two separate gangs, one gang here and one gang there, and this is a kind of no man's land between the two areas. Well, Shea was involved in one gang, and he and his friend were crossing the park, and they were spotted by the rival gang. And the rival gang had their dogs with them, pit bull dogs, and as they saw Shea and his friend cross the park, they unleashed their dogs to allow the dogs to chase them. And the boys ran, and they came to the edge of the park, which has a 6-foot fence, and the dogs attacked them and savaged them. And as they were fighting off the dogs, the guys who were in the gang arrived and stabbed Shea to death, and stabbed his friend, who was within an inch of his life. But his friend was able to vault the fence and escape, and Shea couldn't, and he kept getting dragged back by the dogs. This was big news in London. I don't know if anybody recalls it, but it caused quite a sensation. And as a criminologist, again, I felt as if we'd crossed a line. I felt as if we were into new territory. I hadn't seen or heard of this type of thing before, and I found it very distressing and very shocking. But I wanted to look into it more deeply. And as I began to look into it more deeply, I found this whole world, if you like, of status dogs and weapon dogs. And I also found that nobody had written about this before. There wasn't anything written about it. And I thought that was very, very strange indeed. Because, you know, as somebody who regularly listens to the talk radio shows in London, which are very big, and reads the press, I was aware of some of the issues around the Dangerous Dogs Act and how this was becoming a big issue for people. So I was amazed that nobody had really tackled this topic. This is the guy who was responsible for wielding the knife and killing Shea. His name is Christian Johnson. Now, he was caught, and he was caught for one particular reason. During the stabbing frenzy that went on, his dog, this dog here, was accidentally injured and was bleeding. And after the murder, Christian picked up his dog, and there was a trail of blood that went about 500 meters all the way back to where he lived. And because his dog had been microchipped recently, it was on a database. So the police were able to use the DNA from his dog to identify that he was the owner and take it from there. So this is, as it says here, a legal first. Because the DNA from the dog was able to identify the victim. So, I mean, interesting stuff. And in criminological terms, again, very interesting for us. But a very awful and shocking incident. And again, there was something very similar about a year later. Another 16-year-old boy called Kojo Yanga in northwest London. Very similar kind of scenario. So this is my research. Took about 4 years to do. It was extremely complex, sometimes dangerous, and I did field work between those particular dates. The real challenge here in terms of methodology is you cannot just go up to somebody and say, have you got this dog because you don't have any mates? Or do you have this dog because you're in status deficit? Not that they would understand what that meant, but You know, so all of that is extremely difficult to engage with in terms of interacting with people and researching people. And there were huge ethical issues about researcher safety. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I had to devise a whole methodology, if you like, of trying to work out what was going on in this world and why dogs were being used in this way. So I began reading through the literature. There wasn't very much of it because nobody had written about this. I then did what we call in my world a critical discourse analysis, which basically means you get all the newspapers and then you set them out and you look at how dogs have been referred to in the press, in the headline, in the subheadline, in the text, the images that are used, etc., etc. And you look at the tabloid press and you look at the broadsheet press and you try and see that there's a difference. I then did hospital analysis. I had to FOI, Freedom of Information requests, to about 40 different hospitals to try and get information on dog bites. And what you find is that their data is absolutely crap. It's, they don't record half the dog bites. They certainly don't record the breed of dog that's been involved. So you can't really use that information very well. So then I thought I'd better go and see if I can find any of these dogs in various parks. So I visited 40 parks in 10 London boroughs in all weathers. Very, very difficult to do, to try and see if I could see these dogs. I then did a number of in-depth interviews with people who worked with dogs, but also with professionals and residents, and then with gang-affiliated young people. And then on top of that, I did 138 interviews with the owners of these dogs. Now, it started out as 138, but I was only actually able to complete a much smaller number of that because during these interviews, a variety of different things happened. So these these people here, see, there you go, 33 successfully completed. So I would approach these people and I tried different methods of approaching them. To begin with, I tried taking a dog with me. So I borrowed, this is where it gets a bit crazy. I thought, if I have a dog, I'll be able to engage them more easily in conversation. So I don't have a dog at this point in time in my life, but I borrowed a friend's red setter. And that really did not work at all. For so many reasons, it just did not work. So I went and I found a neighbour, and the neighbour said, well, I've got a staffy. And I said, well, can I borrow your staffy? So I borrowed the staffy, and I thought for at least the first couple of interviews that was perhaps going to work, but then my dog would start interacting with their dog, and it became distracting, and I'm trying to ask questions when it's being pulled in the lead, and I thought, no, that's not going to work either. And then, unfortunately, because of ethical guidelines, I wasn't able to do it covertly or secretly. So I had to be really quite upfront with people. So it took me a long time to find a way of interviewing these guys. And they were mostly guys, not exclusively. And then I hit on the idea that I would have to engage them in conversation. And if they got chatting, I could then eventually say, look, I'm researching this, I'm studying this, can I talk to you in more detail about it? At which point, about half of them just said, no, piss off. Or other words to that effect. And then some of them would ask me for money, and they'd say, yeah, I'll do it, but, you know, I want to buy some drugs around the corner, so give us 20 quid and da-da-da. So, of course, I said no to that. And then some of them I had to terminate because the dog was beginning to be threatening. And I don't know if I wasn't interacting with it carefully or whatever, but it was becoming a bit of a worry, and I terminated the interview. And on a few occasions, I terminated the interview because I was threatened. Halfway through, the guys who were, some of them had been smoking drugs, I think, but they began to get a bit paranoid, perhaps because of the types of questions I was asking. So they would get paranoid, and they would accuse me of being from the feds, which for older people in the room means the police. And then on a couple of occasions, you know, they were kind of overtly threatening and threatened to set the dog on me. So I just had to terminate and run. So what I decided to do was I found various locations. I found parks, high streets, buses, tubes, public transport, and then I stood outside the Harmsworth Hospital in Animal Hospital in North London for about two or 3 months, interviewing guys who had taken their dog there to get stitched up. Now these are guys whose dogs have quite often been involved in fighting, and their dogs had been injured, and they'd taken them there to get stitched up or fixed. And Dr. David Grant, who's just retired, eminent veterinary surgeon who wrote the introduction for the book, I was very pleased. I interviewed him on a couple of occasions, and he told me that his staff were now so fearful of the type of individuals who were coming in to the animal hospital in Harmsworth, they had had to put in CCTV, they'd had to put in shutter screens that could drop down at a press of a button, they'd put in an airlock at the entrance to the door, so you had to be buzzed in and then airlocked and then buzzed through again. You know, £10,000 worth of improvements. And you would go in, and there were 2 lines of seats and chairs, and you'd have, down one side, you'd have all these guys with their, you know, pit bull dogs or pit bull type, similar looking crossbreed dogs, anchored on chains that could anchor a ship, as far as I was concerned, all braced up with leather harnesses and studs. And then on the other side, you had all these old grannies with their little cats and things, absolutely shaking with fear. So I thought, well, this is a very strange scenario. That's not what the vets would like when I went. But anyway, it was a useful source of getting the information and a useful location.